The Galactic Coalition expected Earth to send its finest strategists, decorated generals draped in medals and bound by noble codes of engagement. Instead, the cargo ramps lowered and outwalked men with no insignia, dead eyes, and a history written in classified ink. Earth didn't send generals. They sent killers. The Vayan High Command Room was a masterpiece of crystalline architecture bathed in a soft, ethereal blue light that was supposed to induce calm. Right now, it was a tomb. For 3 solar cycles, the Veal had been systematically dismantled by the Crit Vanguard. The Crit were a brutal, highly regimented species that fought with a mechanical ruthlessness the Vayan honor code simply could not comprehend. The Veil fought with strict rules of engagement, announcing their artillery strikes to allow non-combatants to flee and refusing to use weapons that caused undue suffering. The Crit used these rules as a road map to slaughter them. Desperate, the Coalition reached out to the newest, most volatile species on the fringes of known space, humanity. Earth's military history was a terrifying anomaly to the galactic community. They were a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing one another before even touching the stars. The Coalition begged for Earth's greatest strategic minds, their equivalent of high marshals and grand admirals, to teach them how to hold the line. What arrived at the primary docking bay of Aegis Prime was a rusting, unpolished dropship that didn't bear the insignia of the United Nations Space Command or the European Defense Front. It bore nothing at all. General Kalen of the Vale stood at attention with his honor guard, expecting an entourage of dignified officers in pristine uniforms. Instead, the pressurized doors hissed open and the smell of ozone, old sweat, and gun oil spilled out. Down the ramp walked 30 humans. They wore mismatched, dark cold tactical gear. No shiny metals, no polished boots. Some wore scuffed combat vests. Others had modular rigs loaded with kinetic magazines and serrated combat knives. Their leader stepped forward. He was a man in his late 40s with a face like weathered granite, graying hair cropped tight to his skull and a scar that ran jaggedly across his jawline. General Kalen, the man said. His voice was gravel, completely devoid of the melodic cadence the Vale were used to. "I'm John Hayes, we're the advisory group." Kalen blinked his 4 eyes in confusion. "Mr. Hayes, I was expecting General. Forgive me, I struggle with human names." General Mitchell or Admiral Davies, the architects of the Orion campaign. Hayes spat a wad of synthetic tobacco onto the pristine docking bay floor. Kalen's honor guard flinched. "Mitchell is a politician in a uniform. General Davies is a logistical manager. Your diplomats told our politicians that you were losing a war because the enemy wasn't playing by the rules." Hayes looked around the pristine, fragile beauty of the docking bay. "Earth decided you didn't need generals, you needed problem solvers." "And what military branch do you represent?" Kalen asked, trying to mask his growing unease. "We don't," a woman behind Hayes said. She was tall, lean, and carried a customized kinetic antimaterial rifle over her shoulder. Her name was Sarah Jenkins. "Most of us haven't worn a government uniform in a decade." Kalen accessed his data pad, scanning the sparse files Earth had transmitted. He frowned. "It says here you were formerly employed by Constellas and Triple Canopy. What are these specialized tactical regiments?" Hayes offered a grim, humorless smile. "You could say that. Back on Earth, they call us private military contractors, PMCs. We go where governments can't officially go, and we do the things they don't want on the evening news." The Vale had no concept of mercenaries or private armies. To them, war was a sacred, tragic duty borne by the state. The idea that violence was a corporate service bought and paid for by the highest bidder was abhorrent, but the Vale were dying and they had no luxury of moral high ground. "Very well," Kalen sighed, leading them through the corridors. "The situation on the planet Tartius is dire. The Crit have besieged our primary fuel refinery. If it falls, our fleet in this sector is grounded. We have tried every recognized tactical formation. The Crit simply overrun us with overwhelming numbers and disregard for their own casualties." "What's your current strategy?" Hayes asked, his eyes scanning the architecture, unconsciously noting choke points and lines of sight. "We have formed a defensive perimeter along the valley ridge," Kalen explained proudly. "A traditional shield wall formation. We exchange fire, holding the high ground to maintain honor and tactical superiority." Jenkins let out a sharp laugh. Hayes just shook his head. "You're lining your men up to get shot at by an enemy that outnumbers you 10 to 1. Hayes stated flatly, "That's not a strategy, General. That's a firing squad. It is the honorable way to fight." Kalen bristled, his dermal plating flushing a deep violet. "Honor is a luxury for the winning side," Hayes replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You hired us to keep you alive. So starting right now, you don't fight with honor, you fight to win. We take command of the Tardius defense and we do it our way." Tardis was a miserable, ash-choked rock. The sky was permanently bruised with toxic storm clouds, and the ground was a jagged expanse of obsidian and gray dust. The Vayan defensive line was exactly as Kalen had described, a neat, orderly row of energy barricades perched on a ridge overlooking the valley where the crit swarmed like armored locusts. When Hayes and his team of 30 operators arrived via drop pod, the Vayan soldiers looked at them with a mixture of awe and disgust. The humans immediately began dismantling the pristine defenses. "What are you doing?" screamed Captain Lear, the Vayan officer in charge of the ridge. "You are destroying our cover. Your cover is a beacon," Captain muttered, a heavy-set human named Cole who was busy wiring block charges of C4 to the energy generators. "It tells the enemy exactly where to shoot. We're moving off the ridge." "Moving off the ridge? That means surrendering the high ground," Lear protested. Hayes walked up to the Vayan officer, towering over him slightly. "The crit have heavy plasma artillery. They haven't used it yet because they're inching into range. Once they do, they're going to turn this ridge into glass. We aren't holding the ridge, we're giving it to them." For the next 12 hours, the humans worked with terrifying efficiency. They didn't build walls, they dug holes. They laced the valley floor and the abandoned ridge with a cocktail of volatile chemicals stripped from the Vayan fuel reserves, mixed with shrapnel harvested from broken transport ships. It was an improvised explosive strategy straight out of the darkest chapters of Earth's modern warfare. They set up overlapping fields of crossfire in the jagged rocks below the ridge, completely concealed from the naked eye and thermal scans using thermal blankets and mud. The humans spread out, integrating themselves among the panicked Vayan squads. They didn't give rousing speeches. They just checked their weapons, chambered rounds, and waited in silence. At dawn, the crit attacked. They came in a massive, disciplined wave, thousands of towering, chitinous soldiers marching in perfect lockstep, chanting a war dirge that shook the ash from the sky. They expected the Vel to meet them with energy bolts from the ridge. Instead, the ridge was silent. Thinking the Vale had retreated in cowardice, the crit vanguard surged forward, breaking their rigid formation to claim the high ground. They flooded the ridge, thousands of them packing into the narrow space, raising their banners. In the mud-soaked trench below, Hayes watched the monitor on his wrist. The thermal blooms showed the crit perfectly clustered directly over the buried C4 and fuel cells. "Cole," Hayes whispered into his comms. "Firing," Cole replied. The detonation didn't just shake the ground, it shattered the sky. The ridge erupted in a blinding column of orange fire and pulverized rock. The concussive wave threw Vayan soldiers off their feet in the trenches, deafening them. When the smoke cleared, the ridge was gone. It had been reduced to a smoldering crater. 3,000 crit shock troops had been vaporized in a fraction of a second. Captain Lear stared in absolute horror. "By the ancestors, you didn't even engage them in combat, you just erased them." "Not all of them," Jenin said coldly, peering through the scope of her rifle. The crit lines were in chaos, but their commanders were ruthless. They forced the surviving infantry forward into the jagged rocks where the humans and Veal hid. This was where the true horror of human warfare was revealed to the galaxy. The PMCs didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like apex predators. They used guerrilla tactics that had been perfected in the jungles of Vietnam, the mountains of Afghanistan, and the urban hellscapes of Grozny. When a crit squad advanced, human operators would wait until the enemy walked past them, then open fire from behind, targeting the weaker joints in the alien armor. Before the crit could turn, the humans vanished back into the smoke and shadows. A human named Adler had rigged Vayan sonic communicators to broadcast the screams of dying crit soldiers on a loop, projecting the sound through the fog to disorient the enemy. The crit, who relied on strict auditory commands, broke down in panic. Then came the close-quarters combat. When the crit finally breached the Vayan trenches, expecting to slaughter the fragile aliens, they were met by men like Hayes. Hayes didn't use an energy rifle. He used a pump-action kinetic shotgun. At close range, the heavy tungsten buckshot tore through the Kraken like wet paper. Lear watched Hayes move through the trench. The human was a machine. Blast, pump, blast, step. A crit warrior lunged with a plasma blade. Hayes sidestepped, drew a serrated combat knife and drove it up through the unarmored gap beneath the alien's jaw, twisting it violently before kicking the body away. Hayes didn't shout. He didn't show anger or fear. His face was a mask of bored, terrifying competence. Within 4 hours, the crit offensive broke. For the first time in the war, the unstoppable alien vanguard sounded a retreat. They left behind thousands of dead. The Vayan casualties were in the single digits. The humans didn't celebrate. They simply began walking among the crit bodies. Whenever they saw a twitching alien attempting to crawl away, a human would calmly raise a sidearm and put a bullet in its brain. Double tapping, a standard PMC protocol, Lear vomited. To the Vale, executing a wounded enemy was the ultimate sin. To the humans, leaving an enemy alive to shoot you in the back tomorrow was a failure of logic. The victory at Deadliest sent shock waves through the coalition. They had held the refinery, but the after-action reports horrified the Vayan Senate. General Kalen summoned Hayes to a tribunal via secure hologram. Commander Hayes. Kalen's voice trembled with a mix of awe and deep revulsion. You held the sector, but the reports I am reading utilizing chemical incendiaries, psychological torture, mutilating the dead, firing on fleeing combatants. These are war crimes. Hayes sat in a folding chair, wiping thick, dark crit blood off his combat knife with a rag. He didn't look up at the hologram. War crimes require a convention, General. You guys don't have a Geneva, and even if you did, I stopped caring about Geneva a long time ago. We won. You sacrificed the sacred ridge of oak, a monument of our ancestors, Kalen shouted. I sacrificed a pile of rocks to kill 3,000 hostiles. Hayes corrected him, finally looking up, his eyes dead and cold. You want to fight a clean war, Kalen? Go ahead. Line your boys up and let them die with their honor intact. But if you want to win, you let us off the leash. My men from Kaineli's from Academy. We learned the hard way that when the enemy wants to exterminate you, the only language they understand is disproportionate violence. Before Kalen could argue further, the command sense alarms blared. The tactical map on the central console flared crimson. Report. Kalen barked to his aides, Sir, it's the crit. An aide panicked. They've adapted. They realized they cannot take the refinery by ground assault. They deployed a cloaked insertion team behind our lines. They've breached the diplomatic spire in Sector 4. Kalen's face drained of color. The High Ambassador is in that spire. If he is captured or killed, the coalition will fracture. Hayes stood up, tossing the bloodied rag aside. How many hostiles? 50 elite Kritorians. The aide reported they have barricaded the spire. They are holding the ambassador hostage. They demand our unconditional surrender of the planet within 2 hours, or they execute him and broadcast it to the galaxy. Kalen slumped. It is over. We do not have the hostage rescue capabilities for a fortified spire. Our breach teams would take hours just to break the kinetic shielding, and the Taurians will execute him the moment we try. Your breach teams would, Hayes said, grabbing his helmet, because you guys knock on the front door. Hayes walked out to the landing pad where his team was resting. Listen up, he barked. The 30 operators snapped to attention. They were battered, bruised, and covered in alien blood, but their eyes were locked onto him. The crit have a VIP hostage in Sector 4, High Ambassador. They're holding a fortified spire, Hayes announced. Cole racked the bolt on his heavy machine gun. Rules of engagement, boss. The crit think they have leverage, Hayes said, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register. We're going to show them that taking hostages only works if the people rescuing them care about collateral damage. No negotiations, no warnings. We are going black. The human team didn't board a standard transport. They requisitioned a Vayan atmospheric stealth glider, ripping out the safety harnesses to make room for heavy ordnance. As the glider cut through the toxic clouds toward the spire, Jenkins knelt beside Hayes, prepping breaching charges. Boss, if this spire is as fortified as they say, standard entry is going to get the VIP killed. We aren't doing a standard entry, Hayes said. He pulled up the structural schematics of the spire. The Veil build everything with glass and crystalline alloys. It's beautiful, but it's brittle. The Taurians are holed up in the penthouse suite 120 stories up. They've reinforced the doors and the elevators. They are watching the stairs. So where are we going in? Cole asked. Hayes tapped the glass roof of the spire on the hologram. We don't go through the doors. We bring the roof down on their heads. the GL. Eider approached the spire under the cover of a massive thunderstorm. The Kritorians inside the penthouse were confident. They were the elite standing over the trembling Vayan High Ambassador. Their leader, a hulking monstrosity in heavy crimson armor, watched the perimeter feeds. He expected a slow, honorable Vayan siege. He expected a negotiator to call. Instead, the sky above them exploded. Hayes and his team didn't land. They jumped from the glider 100 FT above the spire, using directional micro-thrusters to guide their fall. Cole and Jenkins fired specialized thermal breaching rockets midair directly into the reinforced glass roof of the penthouse. The glass shattered inward in a deadly rain of shrapnel. Before the Taurians could even raise their weapons, 30 human operators dropped through the ceiling like heavily armed gargoyles. They hit the ground firing. There was no hesitation, no shouted demands to surrender. The humans utilized a room-clearing technique honed in the bloodiest urban sprawls on Earth. Total overwhelming sensory domination. Flashbang grenades detonated, searing the multifaceted eyes of the Crit. Hayes landed directly on top of a Taurian guard, driving his knees into the alien's neck with a sickening crunch, simultaneously raising his shotgun and blowing the head off a second guard across the room. The Crit leader roared, raising his plasma cannon toward the ambassador. He would kill the hostage and fulfill his duty. He never pulled the trigger. Jenkins, who had landed on a structural crossbeam above the fray, put a high-velocity depleted uranium round through the leader's shoulder joint, blowing his arm completely off. As the giant alien stumbled back, Hayes closed the distance. He didn't shoot. He grabbed the Crit leader by the chest plate, slammed him into the wall, and shoved the barrel of his sidearm under the alien's chin. The room went dead silent. Out of 50 Taurians, 49 were dead on the floor. It had taken exactly 11 seconds. The Vayan High Ambassador was curled in a ball, weeping, unheard, but traumatized by the sheer unadulterated violence he had just witnessed. Hayes looked into the eyes of the surviving Crit leader. The alien was trembling not from pain but from shock. The Crit were bred for war, but they had never seen a species weaponize brutality with such surgical precision. What are you?" the Crit gasped in broken universal translation. Hayes leaned in close, his voice a rasp of pure malice. "I'm the guy who doesn't play by the rules. Tell your fleet commander something for me. Earth didn't send its generals. We aren't here to sign treaties. We're here to clean house, and if another Crit ship enters this system," Hayes pressed the barrel harder into the alien's kitten, "we won't just kill your soldiers, we will follow you home. Do you understand?" The Crit leader nodded weakly. "Good," Hayes said. Then he pulled the trigger, executing the alien on the spot. The ambassador screamed in horror. He had surrendered. You told him to deliver a message. Hayes holstered his weapon, looking at the ambassador with cold indifference. "I lied. I'm going to send his head back on a supply drone. It makes a better point." The supply drone breached the atmospheric threshold of Tardius, ascending into the cold vacuum of orbit, where the Crit armada hung like a plague of iron locusts. Aboard the flagship Scourge, Overlord Vask stood on his command deck. He was a veteran of a dozen planetary conquests, a titan of kitten and muscle who had never known the bitter taste of defeat. When the drone's cargo bay opened on the hangar deck, Vask's lieutenants expected a message of surrender from the Vayan High Ambassador. Instead, they found a simple reinforced permaglass box. Inside rested the severed head of the Taurian commander. Pinned to the commander's fractured helmet was a physical piece of synthetic parchment, a primitive medium the Crit hadn't used in millennia. Written in thick, dark blood were 3 words in the universal standard script: "You're next, Earth." Vask shattered the glass box with a single strike of his armored fist. A primal roar of fury echoed through the cavernous hangar. The Veil were weak, pathetic creatures of diplomacy and hollow honor. They did not do this. This was the work of the new variable, the humans. "Target the planetary surface," Vask bellowed, marching back to the command deck. "Calculate the coordinates of their defensive command. I want maximum yield orbital strikes. Turn their remaining cities to ash. If these humans wish to fight like savages, they will die like them." Down on the surface of Aegis Prime, the mood in the Coalition Command Center was a suffocating mix of salvation and profound horror. General Kalen watched the tactical display as the Crit Armada began shifting into orbital bombardment formations. "You have doomed us, Commander Hayes," Kalen whispered, his voice trembling. "They are not retreating. They are preparing to glass. The continent, we do not have the planetary shields to withstand a sustained orbital bombardment. John Hayes stood by the holographic projection, calmly restrapping the ceramic armor plates on his chest rig. The rest of his PMC squad was scattered around the room, reloading magazines, checking zero on their optics, and patching up minor flesh wounds with medical staplers. They looked less like saviors and more like mechanics finishing a dirty, exhausting shift. "They aren't going to bombard anything," General Hayes said, tapping a coordinate on the map. "Orbital bombardment requires the flagship to lower its kinetic barriers to open the heavy plasma silos. When they do that, their command ship is vulnerable for exactly 4 minutes." Kalen blinked, his 4 eyes struggling to process the human's calm demeanor. "Vulnerable to what? Our fleet is in ruins. We have nothing that can pierce their hull in 4 minutes, you don't." Sarah Jenkins chimed in, racking the bolt of her anti-material rifle with a metallic clack that made the Vayan aides jump. "But we do. We salvaged a crit-heavy transport from the Tartarus Ridge before we blew it to hell. Cole got the transponder codes working." Kalen stared at them in disbelief. "You intend to fly a salvaged enemy transport directly into the heart of an armada. They will scan you. They will realize it is a trick." "Not if the ship registers as full of dead crit," Adler said with a dark chuckle, adjusting a data pad on his wrist. "We loaded the cargo bay with 100 of their corpses. Thermal scanners will read a ship full of cooling crit bodies. They'll think it's an automated casualty retrieval barge. By the time they realize the bodies are dead, we'll already be inside the flagship. This is madness." "It is a suicide mission," Kalen protested. "It's only suicide if you plan on dying," Hayes replied flatly. "General, keep your remaining anti-air batteries firing. Make them think you're desperate. Draw Vask's attention, we'll handle the rest." The salvaged crit transport shuddered violently as it broke atmosphere. Inside the cramped, blood-stained cockpit, Hayes took the controls, the air ryer of alien ichor and ozone. In the back, 29 operators sat in pitch darkness, their magnetic boots locked to the floor deck, breathing in measured shallow breaths to conserve oxygen. As they approached the Scourge, the radio crackled with guttural crit challenges. Adler, sitting in the co-pilot seat, ran a bypass algorithm through the ship's transponder, transmitting a falsified automated distress signal indicating catastrophic life support failure. For agonizing minutes, the massive automated turrets of the crit flagship tracked them. The targeting lasers painted the hull of their small transport. If the crit decided to simply vaporize the barge, it would be over in a microsecond. But the rigid, unquestioning doctrine of the crit saved the humans. Protocol dictated that casualty barges be recovered to harvest genetic material. The tractor beam engaged. The transport was yanked roughly into the secondary hangar bay of the Scourge. The moment the ship touched down, Hayes cut the power. "Masks on, go dark," Hayes ordered over the internal squad comms. 30 operators pulled down their rebreather masks and activated their night vision optics. The world shifted into a crisp, monochromatic green. Outside the transport, a squad of crit engineers approached, carrying heavy plasma torches to cut open the seemingly dead ship. They bypassed the main ramp and moved toward the lateral airlock. They didn't realize the humans had already rigged the airlock with a directional explosive. Boom, the airlock door blew outward, instantly decapitating the 2 lead engineers. Before the smoke could even clear, the humans poured out of the breach like a swarm of angry hornets. They didn't shout, they didn't rally. They moved with terrifying fluid synchronicity. Silenced kinetic weapons coughed quietly in the vacuum of the depressurized hangar. Thip, thip, thip. Crit guards dropped to the floor, their armor pierced by armor-piercing tungsten rounds designed specifically to shatter kitten. The humans moved in pairs, clearing the hangar bay in less than 40 seconds. Every downed alien received a merciless double tap to the skull. No prisoners, no wounded left behind to trigger an alarm. "Hangar," Cole whispered into the comms. "Adler, find me a path to the bridge." Adler jacked a data spike into a wall terminal. "I have the schematics. Boss, the bridge is 20 decks up, but we have a problem. They've initiated lockdown. Blast doors are dropping. We can't shoot our way through 20 decks of reinforced durasteel." Hayes looked at the massive ventilation shafts above them, designed to cycle the immense heat generated by the flagship's plasma engines. "We don't go through the doors, we go through the lungs." For the next hour, the human PMCs crawled through the suffocating, sweltering heat of the flagship's ventilation system. The temperature hover at near 130 degrees. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes. But these were men and women who had endured the scorching deserts of the Middle East and the humid hell of equatorial jungles on Earth. They simply gritted their teeth and kept crawling. Below them, the crit crew was completely oblivious. They were a species that relied on brute force and frontal assaults. The concept of an enemy bypassing their impenetrable blast doors by crawling through the maintenance shafts was so utterly foreign to their tactical doctrine that they didn't even monitor the thermal sensors in the vents. They reached the grating above the main corridor leading to the bridge. Through the slats, Hayes could see a dozen elite Taurian guards stationed outside the command deck, heavily armed and scanning the empty hallway. Jenkins, Cole, Hayes signaled with tight, sharp hand gestures. Sync. Jenkins and Cole carefully unclipped flashbangs and fragmentation grenades from their rigs. Hayes counted down on his fingers. 3, 2, 1. They kicked the grating out and dropped the grenades. The explosions were deafening in the enclosed corridor. Shrapnel tore through the Taurians' legs and the blinding flash overloaded their optical receptors. Before the aliens could even raise their weapons, the PMCs dropped from the ceiling. It was a slaughter. At close quarters, the long, unwieldy plasma rifles of the crit were useless against the compact, suppressed submachine guns and combat shotguns of the humans. Hayes landed on a wounded Taurian, driving his combat knife through the soft tissue at the base of its neck. "Breach the door," Hayes barked, pulling his knife free. Cole slapped a massive block of C4 against the locking mechanism of the bridge's blast door. "Fire in the hole." The blast door blew inward with the force of a localized hurricane, tearing the hinges from the bulkhead. Smoke and jagged metal rained across the pristine, heavily digitized command deck of the Scourge. Overlord Vask turned, his heavy plasma cannon already spooling up. He expected to see a desperate Vayan strike team. Instead, out of the smoke walked shadows. The humans moved with a terrifying predatory grace. They didn't attack in a wave. They spread out instantly, utilizing cover, establishing intersecting fields of fire and dismantling the bridge crew with cold, clinical precision. Vask roared, firing a massive bolt of superheated plasma. It scorched the bulkhead, melting a control console into slag, but the human he aimed at Jenkins had already slid underneath the blast, popping up to fire a 3-round burst of armor-piercing rounds directly into the joint of Rosk's firing arm. The Overlord staggered, his arm hanging limp, blue blood spraying across the deck. The remaining crit bridge officers tried to draw their ceremonial blades, abandoning their stations to charge the intruders. It was a fatal mistake of pride. The humans gunned them down mercilessly, their kinetic weapons chewing through flesh and bone. Within 30 seconds, the massive command deck was a graveyard. Only Vask remained, leaning heavily against the central command table, clutching his ruined arm. He stared at the humans as they slowly closed the circle around him. They didn't look triumphant, they looked annoyed. Hayes stepped forward, his kinetic shotgun leveled at the Overlord's chest. "You," Vask gasped, blood bubbling from his mandibles. "You have no honor, you skulk in the shadows like vermin, you do not face your enemies in the light." Hayes didn't smile. He didn't offer a monologue about the indomitable human spirit. He simply looked at the alien warlord with the dead, tired eyes of a man who had seen too much death to care about speeches. "Honor is a comforting lie dead men tell themselves," Hayes said quietly. "You came into this system thinking war was a game of formations and rules. You thought you were the apex predators because you hit the hardest, but you forgot the most important rule of the jungle." Hayes stepped closer, the barrel of his shotgun pressing against the cracked kitten of Vask's chest plate. "It's not the biggest animal that survives, it's the meanest." Hayes pulled the trigger. The heavy tungsten slug tore through Vask's chest, destroying his primary and secondary hearts. The massive warlord collapsed backward, dead before he hit the deck. "Adler, how long until the fleet realizes their command ship just went dark?" Hayes asked, immediately turning away from the corpse. "They're already pinging us, boss," Adler said, frantically typing on his data pad while plugged into the mainframe. "I have control of the flagship's core reactor, but we have company coming. Internal sensors show about 500 heavily armed crit marines heading our way. Set the reactor to overload. Give us a 10-minute fuse," Hayes ordered, Everyone else plant thermite charges on the navigational computers and the comms relays. We're blinding them before we blow them to hell. The team worked. In frenzied silence, within 2 minutes the bridge was rigged to burn. Adler pulled the data spike. Core overload initiated. Boss, we don't have time to crawl back through the vents. The Marines are sealing the decks. We aren't crawling back, Hayes said, looking out the massive viewport at the starry expanse of space where the hijacked transport was still docked 2 miles below them. Cole, blow the glass, Cole grinned wildly. He placed a series of micro-balking charges in a circle on the reinforced permaglass viewport. Helmets on, magnetic boots engage, Hayes yelled. 30 operators slammed their helmets shut, the seals hissing as they locked. They activated the magnetic clamps on their boots, anchoring themselves to the deck. Cole hit the detonator. The viewport shattered. The explosive decompression was instantaneous and violently powerful. The vacuum of space ripped into the bridge, sucking the dead crit bodies, loose consoles, and debris out into the freezing void. The humans held their ground, their boots clamped firmly to the metal floor, fighting the immense pull of the vacuum. Move, Hayes ordered. They disengaged their boots and let the vacuum pull them out into space. It was a terrifying silent freefall. For a horrifying minute, the 30 PMCs floated in the cold void, untethered, surrounded by the debris of the flagship. They used their suits' micro-thrusters to navigate the debris field, angling their descent toward the secondary hangar bay where their hijacked transport awaited. They hit the hangar deck hard, rolling to absorb the impact, magnetic boots instantly locking back onto the hull. They scrambled into the transport, slamming the airlock shut and pressurizing the cabin just as the flagship's internal alarms reached a frantic, silent crescendo. Hayes punched the thrusters and the battered transport shot out of the hangar bay, burning hard for the planet's surface. Behind them, the Scourge shuddered. A brilliant, blinding white light erupted from its core. The reactor overload consumed the flagship in a silent, expanding sphere of nuclear fire, vaporizing it instantly. The resulting shock wave slammed into the surrounding crit cruisers, stripping their shields and sending them spinning out of formation. With their flagship destroyed, their overlord dead, and their communications network in shambles, the rigid crit collapsed. Panic, an emotion they had entirely bred out of their frontline soldiers, but not their naval navigators, took over. Without orders, the Armada broke orbit, fleeing into hyperspace jumps to escape the terrifying unseen enemy that had just decapitated their invincible fleet. Down on Aegis Prime, General Kalen stood on the balcony of the command center, watching the distant flashes of light in the sky as the crit armada fractured and fled. The Vayan senators behind him were weeping with relief, praising the ancestors for their miraculous salvation. But Kalen didn't feel relief. He felt a deep, chilling dread. Hours later, the battered human transport touched down on the landing pad. Hayes and his team walked down the ramp. They were exhausted, their armor scorched, their weapons nearly empty, but they were alive. All 30 of them. Kalen approached Hayes. He didn't offer a salute. He couldn't. The crit have fled the sector, Kalen said softly, his voice devoid of the usual Vayan melodic LLT. You have saved our world, Commander Hayes. The Coalition is forever in your debt. Hayes unclipped his helmet, running a dirty hand through his graying hair. Wire the rest of the payment to the offshore accounts listed in the contract. We'll be leaving in the morning. Kalen hesitated. The Senate wishes to offer humanity a permanent seat on the Coalition Security Council. They believe your strategic minds could usher in a new era of galactic defense. Hayes let out a dry, rasping laugh. General, you don't want us on your council. You looked at us today and saw monsters. You're grateful we killed the wolves at your door, but you're terrified because you realized you invited a bigger, meaner predator inside your house. Kalen couldn't meet the humans' eyes because Hayes was right. The Coalition had survived, but they had sacrificed their innocence. They had learned that the universe was not a place of honorable duels and noble sacrifices. It was a dark, violent alleyway, and humanity was the apex predator waiting in the shadows. Keep your honor, General, Hayes said, turning back toward his ship. We'll keep the monsters away. Just make sure the check clears. If you loved this gritty dive into human resilience and absolute tactical dominance, smash that like button and share this story with your fellow sci-fi fans. Humanity doesn't always play by the rules, but we always get the job done. Want more epic HFY tales where Earth shows the galaxy why you never mess with our veterans? Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment below on what alien threat we should destroy.